My name is Rear Admiral Taylor, and on a sun-bright pier rimmed with flags and camera tripods, I heard my aunt say clear enough to ride the wind she's only invited because of us. She wore a hat too big for the breeze and a confidence even bigger. Beside her, two family friends nodded in rhythm, pleased to be anchored in the front row of the VIP section. The smell of salt and fresh paint drifted off the destroyer's hull. Brass gleamed. The Navy band warmed up with scales that rang like coins. I was mid-pier among sailors, not spotlights. Dress whites pressed sharp cover tucked under my arm. The water slapped pilings in a steady heartbeat. The master of ceremonies tested the mic. My aunt leaned toward our cousin's voice pitched with certainty. "It's Claire, that she said. But let's not forget who made the calls. She wouldn't be on that list if not for family." The words didn't sting. Not anymore. They just skim the surface like a gull that doesn't know what lies beneath. The MC took the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, "welcome to the commissioning of the United States ship Resolute." Applause rolled the length of the pier. Sailors in dress blues stood in ranks along the lifelines. Their ribbons caught the sun like tiny flags. "Before we begin," the MC continued, "the band will sound honors." He lifted his hand. The first trumpet cut clean through the day. Cymbals kissed. The march rose bright. Then the voice that carries over shipyards. "Rear Admiral Taylor on deck." Stillness found my aunt. She sat down so fast her hat tipped forward. Cameras swiveled. A first row of dignitaries stood, then the second, then the third, until the movement had the gravity of a tide. I stepped into the aisle between folding chairs and walked toward the stage. Heels, wood sun. Sailors I'd never met straightened. A chief I did know checked me with a glance that said, "Everything and nothing, we see you. Keep going." I passed a line of ship sponsors in spring dresses, hands folded at their waists. I did not look at my aunt. The announcement was not an argument. It was a fact. At the foot of the platform, the MC reached down. "Ma'am," he said, quiet, respectful. I took the step he offered, crossed to the lectern, and set my cover on the left corner, gold-fouled anchor, catching the light. The wind tugged the flag behind me and snapped it straight. I let the band finish the phrase. When the last note faded, I leaned into the mic. "Good morning," I said. "For the record, there are no accidents on a ship, and there are no accidents in a crew. We are here because somebody did the work." A murmur rose then settled. You can feel when a room, even an open-air one, decides to listen. Before I talk about the Resolute, I said I want to talk about this pier. I let my eyes sweep the crowd. Some of you changed flights and worked doubles. Some ironed uniforms at midnight and stitched patches no one will notice. Some kept watch so these sailors could stand here rested and ready. I see you. That was the top note. The rest of part one began hours earlier in a different kind of quiet. At dawn, the harbor was pewter. I parked by the shipyard office and walked the length of the pier, while a tug nudged the Resolute's hip like a dog greeting a long-gone friend. Frost silvered a bollard. My breath ghosted. A boatswain's mate on early detail nodded without a word. I checked the seating plan out of habit. Front rows for dignitaries' ship's company in ranks families in the middle overflow near the band. My name sat where the program said it would speaker, not monarch. Good. By 8, vendors rolled out the runner that would keep heels from biting into the boards. The caterer iced steel tubs. The band cases opened and exhaled brass. A news crew rehearsed beside a coil of line as thick as a man's wrist. I saw my aunt arrive in a coronation of perfume and opinions, flanked by friends who treat any Navy event like a mirror. She has always preferred rooms with first-rows committees with microphones and photographs that can be mailed with a note that begins, "We were honored to..." She hugged me once years ago like a person rehearsing for a photograph. The squeeze didn't survive the flash. I found my place among the sailors. A machinist's mate showed me grease he wouldn't let touch his cuffs. An ensign confessed he'd woken every hour afraid he'd oversleep the first day that counted. I told him that fear never completely leaves. That's how you know you still respect the sea. Now when on deck, finally cut the air, all of that flowed into the present, the sit, fast, The stand tall, the bandsmen lifting their bells higher because a name pulled the phrase into meaning. I didn't look back as I began. Ships aren't christened with champagne alone, I said. They're christened with study sweat and silence, the kind of work that happens in spaces nobody photographs. A gull skimmed the rail and flashed into the glare. The destroyer's hull threw light like a shield. Somewhere behind the ranks, a child asked too loudly if the ship would blow up pirates, and the laughter that followed eased the air without denting its seriousness. My remarks will be brief, I said. Commissionings are about beginnings, and beginnings shouldn't be buried under speeches. The wind shifted and brought a clean rope and diesel ribbon of scent that snapped me back through years of watches and the exact taste of coffee at 03 Winnemfteam. I let it pass. Then I set my hands lightly on the lectern and the day held still like a level horizon. The next part of the story, how this pier came to matter, how a woman with my name arrived mid-pier instead of first row, would have to wait. First, the ship. Officer of the deck, I called, set the watch. The Navy band punched the downbeat. Somewhere in the VIP section, a hat stayed very quiet. I was born into a family where uniforms hung in closets like heirlooms. Photographs of commissioning ceremonies and change of command days lined our hallway, sepia portraits of great-grandfathers in peacoats, my grandfather in starched khakis aboard a cruiser, my uncle shaking hands with a president as a newly promoted admiral. My father never served. He worked the other side of the Navy, the shipyard contracts, the design approvals, the kind of business that meant he always had an invitation to the Navy League dinner and a handshake for every flag officer in the district. My mother, though proud of the Navy name, preferred the social current it brought. Her sister, my Aunt Margaret, perfected it. Margaret married my uncle when he was a rising commander. She had a knack for finding the nearest camera and the right people to stand beside. If you wanted your name mentioned at the yacht club or the Navy League ball, you stood close to Margaret. She kept mental ledgers of who owed her a favor and who she could help. From the time I was old enough to fit in patent leather shoes, she saw me as part of her inventory. At family events, she'd pull me aside, smooth my dress, and tell me, "Always be gracious, dear. You're representing the family name." But it never felt like she was talking about service or integrity. It was about appearances. When I got my appointment to the Naval Academy, I thought foolishly that maybe she'd be proud. That maybe for once, my place at the table wouldn't be courtesy of her seating chart. Instead, at my graduation party, she told a Navy League friend within earshot. We pulled some strings. Claire's bright, but these things never happen without help. The friend smiled and sipped his champagne. I stood there with my glass of water, learning my first lesson in how easily other people rewrite your story. That was the beginning of a pattern. Every promotion, every billet in her telling had been smoothed over by her network. If someone mentioned my assignment to a destroyer out of Mayport, she'd say, "Yes, well, we know the Commodore." When I screened for department head early, she remarked, "She's been so fortunate to have us guiding her." It wasn't just me. Margaret believed success was always tied to proximity to her, to my uncle, to the name that opened doors in the right zip codes. She didn't understand the hours on the bridge in a sea state that made your teeth hurt, the navigation checks at 0200, the drills and chemical gear that left sweat running down your spine. Those things to her didn't command respect. Being seen in the right box at the Navy ball did. At first, I tried to push back gently. "Aunt Margaret, I earned that posting. The board." She'd wave me off. "Claire, no one earns anything without help. It's who you know. Always remember that." I remembered all right, but not the way she meant. I started keeping my own mental ledger, not of favors, but of moments. Every time someone's opinion of my work was reframed by her into an act of family charity, I tucked it away. Not to fuel a speech or a confrontation, just to keep the truth intact for myself. It was easier to let her think she was the architect of my career than to waste my breath arguing. Because I knew the ocean has a way of measuring you that no committee, no aunt, no handshake can counterfeit. And one day, that measure would be taken in front of the very people who thought they'd written my orders. Margaret never noticed the distance. She was too busy curating the next seating arrangement, the next photograph, the next name drop. She didn't understand that real respect, the kind that keeps a ship's crew with you in a storm, can't be handed out in an invitation. The pier I stood on this morning wasn't the first place she'd try to claim, but it was going to be the last. When I graduated from the academy, my aunt assumed I would take the sensible path, public affairs, maybe legal or anything that kept me in dress uniforms and receptions instead of in steel-toe boots and the engineering plant. She didn't say it outright, but her congratulations card told the story, a gold-embossed Navy crest and a handwritten note. You'll do so well in a role where you can meet the right people. I did the opposite. I went surface warfare. That meant I'd be spending my days and a lot of my nights on the bridge of a ship, conning through tight channels, learning the language of radar scopes, chart tables, and engineering logs. It meant standing watch at Oro 200 while salt mist froze on the railing. My first ship was a guided missile destroyer, home-ported in Mayport. On paper, my first deployment looked straightforward. Work up for exercises, show the flag in Allied ports, come home with a cruise book full of smiling photographs. But a few months in, we were tasked with anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden. It was there that I learned how thin the line can be between escalation and disaster. One morning, we picked up a radar contact trailing a merchant vessel. It had no AIS signal, no flag, and the kind of erratic course that raised every red flag in the book. The captain was ashore in a conference with coalition partners, leaving me as the tactical action officer. The standard play was to close the distance and issue warnings, sometimes enough to make suspicious craft change course. But as I watched the contact's speed and heading, I noticed something off. They weren't gaining on the merchant at all. They were shadowing it at a fixed distance, almost like an escort. I called the merchant on bridge to bridge. The captain's voice was tight but steady. We know them. Local fishermen. They've been keeping other small boats away since last night. If I'd followed the book without that call, we'd have risked turning a protective presence into an armed confrontation. Instead, I ordered a wide berth, kept them on radar, and logged the contact without incident. It wasn't dramatic. No movies were made. But word of that judgment call got back to my CO, then to the Commodore. A week later, during an underway replenishment, the captain told me, "Good instincts, Taylor. Sometimes it's what you don't do that shows you're ready." Back home, when my mother told my aunt about the deployment, Margaret's response was exactly what I expected. She's lucky someone else didn't get blamed if it went wrong. That was the moment I stopped letting her opinion cross the quarterdeck of my mind. Out here, you learned fast that your real resume was written in log entries and the quiet trust of the people who stood watch with you. I doubled down on quals, earned my surface warfare pin early, and started volunteering for collateral duties that most JOs avoided: safety officer, anti-terrorism officer. It wasn't about making myself look indispensable. It was about learning every moving part of the ship and the crew. By the time I rotated to my second ship, I had a reputation for being steady under pressure. Not flashy, not looking for a headline, just the officer you wanted when the radar was cluttered, the radios were busy, and there were too many variables in play. Margaret didn't understand that world. To her, influence was a seat at the right table. To me, influence was when the boatswain's mates on the forecastle watched you take the con in heavy seas and knew they could trust your helm orders with their lives. I wasn't chasing her version of success anymore. I was building something she couldn't borrow, or hand out in an envelope. And while she kept telling people my assignments were fortunate placements, the Navy was already charting me for the kind of commands that didn't arrive by invitation. My first command at sea came faster than I'd expected, and in conditions no amount of ceremony could prepare you for. I was given the USS Griffin, a destroyer with a tight crew and a solid maintenance record, slated for a humanitarian mission in the Pacific. The plan was to deliver relief supplies and medical teams to coastal villages in the Philippines after a string of earthquakes had destroyed roads and left entire communities cut off. We were already 2 days into offloading supplies when the weather turned. A low-pressure system off the coast intensified faster than the forecasts predicted, pulling warm air from the south into a spiral that fattened into a typhoon in less than 12 hours. By dawn, we were receiving fragmented distress calls from local fishing boats. Their small outriggers weren't built to ride out sustained winds over 70 knots, and the swells were already climbing. The nearest Philippine Coast Guard unit was hours away. I didn't need an op order to know what had to happen. We had speed radar and small craft capable of working inshore. What we didn't have was time. On the bridge, the air was thick with humidity and tension. Rain sheeted against the windows. The horizon had vanished into a slate wall. I issued the orders prep. Both RHIBs muster the rescue teams, rig hoists for immediate use. Over the next 6 hours, we worked like a machine. Our coxswains maneuvered through troughs that swallowed half the boat timing each run to crest a swell just long enough to spot the next vessel in trouble. Crew members hauled soaked fishermen over the gunnels, wrapped them in blankets, and pushed out again before the sea could close in. One of our search patterns brought us to a half-capsized banca, a traditional fishing boat. Its bow smashed a family of 4 clinging to the stern. A wave nearly pitched our RHIB sideways, but the team held steady long enough to pass life jackets and pull the children aboard. By late afternoon, the typhoon's edge began to move north, leaving behind a confused sea and a sky split with sudden shafts of sunlight. We'd brought in over 36 people, most of them hypothermic, but alive. Back at port, the Philippine Coast Guard commander shook my hand hard enough to leave marks. "Your ship's work will be remembered here," he said. When the Navy published the official after-action report, the rescue was cited as an example of joint force coordination and rapid response. A few months later, I was awarded the Legion of Merit for the mission. Margaret's reaction over dinner at my parents' house, she leaned toward my mother and said, "The media really blew that story up. I'm sure it was a team effort." It was a team effort, but her tone made it clear she wasn't giving credit, she was taking it away. I let it slide. The truth had already traveled further than her voice ever would. Sailors who'd been there told the story to their next cruise, and I heard pieces of it come back to me like echoes in a wide harbor. That was the thing about the sea and the Navy. Reputation wasn't a social favor. It was a wake behind you. It couldn't be faked, and it couldn't be erased by someone who wasn't on board when the call came in. The Griffin would eventually rotate to a new CO, but that deployment stayed with me, not because of the medal, not because of the headlines, but because it proved something I'd known since my first watch as an ensign, that command is a covenant, not a title. And that covenant is measured in lives brought home. Margaret didn't have a place in that measurement, and for the first time I realized she never would. The envelope was white thick and crisply embossed with a Department of the Navy seal. My name sat centered on the front, in formal block script, Rear Admiral Claire E. Taylor. Inside the card's edges were beveled the lettering in deep Navy ink. "You are cordially invited to serve as the commissioning speaker for USS Resolute DDG 129, Saturday, 1000 hours, Norfolk Naval Station, Pier 12. A commissioning speaker slot isn't a handshake honor. It's a deliberate choice, often months in the making, based on service record leadership reputation, and the message the Navy wants tied to the ship's first day in the fleet. The Resolute would carry her name for decades, and so would the words spoken on that pier. It also happened to be home-ported in my aunt's city. I knew immediately how she'd receive the news, not as recognition of my career, but as an extension of hers. And I was right. Within a week, my mother called to tell me Margaret had already helped secure VIP tickets for herself, 2 friends and a Navy League contact. "She says you're only on the list because of the family name," Mom added, her voice careful. I smiled without humor. "Then let's make sure she enjoys the view." I didn't send Margaret a copy of the program. I didn't mention that my role was more than attendance. The official release would keep the speaking lineup under wraps until the day of a tradition meant to give the ceremony its own surprises. Instead, I kept my focus where it belonged, on the sailors who'd soon call the Resolute home. In the weeks leading up to the event, I toured the nearly completed ship. I walked her decks, inspected her CIC, stood on her bridge wings in the pale winter sun. I met the plank owners, the crew who would form her first watch teams, and listened as they talked about the ship's combat systems, their hopes for deployment schedules, the little things they'd already nicknamed. In the evenings, I worked on my remarks. Commissioning speeches aren't about the speaker. They're about the ship, the crew, and the family navy, and otherwise, who will keep her moving through storms and into port. But I wanted this one to carry a subcurrent, something that could be heard without being named, that no one arrives on a pier like this by accident, and certainly not by borrowed invitation. I thought back to every conversation with Margaret over the years, the little snipes disguised as compliments, the reframing of my qualifications as family favors. I thought about the typhoon rescue, the long watches, the judgment calls no one outside the lifelines would ever hear about. And I knew exactly how to weave that truth into the commissioning without pointing it like a weapon. The week of the ceremony, I confirmed my seating with the coordinator. "Mid-pier is fine," I said, among the sailors. "Ma'am, you're speaking. We can—" "No," I said, smiling. "Leave me there until my name is called." The morning of the event, Norfolk was bright and cold, the air sharp with salt and diesel. The Resolute's hull gleamed against the blue sky, her pennant snapping. Sailors in dress blues moved in crisp lines. Families filled the stands, their chatter rising above the band's warm-up notes. I spotted Margaret instantly front row of the VIP section, cream suit, wide hat, two friends flanking her like a well-positioned portrait. Even from a distance, I could tell she was in her element, shaking hands, leaning in to exchange knowing smiles. I took my place midway down the pier, hat under my arm, watching the crew form ranks along the rail. The band tuned to attention. The MC stepped to the podium. The ship was ready. The pier was ready. I was ready. And in a few moments, the idea that I was only invited because of them was going to sink quietly beneath the weight of reality. The band shifted from its warm-up into the first bars of Anchors Aweigh, the brass and percussion carrying clean over the water. The MC's voice cut in, amplified and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed with the orders to bring USS Resolute to life, we are honored to welcome our commissioning speaker. Please stand for Rear Admiral Taylor on deck." For a heartbeat, the pier seemed to pause. Then chairs scraped back in unison, a wave of movement flowing from the rear toward the front. Sailors in formation along the ship's rail snapped to attention. The band struck the honor march drums, crisp trumpets bright in the winter air. I rose from my seat midway down the pier. My heels found their pace on the weathered boards, measured even each step, keeping time with the music. Sunlight bounced off the water and into my eyes. I narrowed my gaze and fixed on the stage ahead. As I approached the VIP section, Margaret's head turned. Her hat brim tilted up just enough for me to see her mouth part slightly, then close. The confidence she'd worn like a medal all morning seemed to slide an inch out of place. Her friends stopped mid-whisper. She didn't stand. She was already standing. She didn't sit, not yet. She just froze. Then, almost as if someone had tapped her shoulder, she eased back into her chair. A careful motion, but quick, the way you sit when you suddenly don't want eyes on you. I didn't break stride. I passed within arm's reach and kept my eyes forward, not because I was avoiding her, but because this moment was never about her. The band played the final flourish as I mounted the steps to the stage. The MC met me with a handshake and a quiet, "Ma'am, welcome." I set my cover on the lectern and took a breath, letting the applause fade. "Good morning," I began. "Today, we welcome USS Resolute into the fleet. A ship is more than steel and systems. She's the sum of the people who will sail her and the values they'll carry over every horizon." Faces leaned in. The front rows softened their posture. I spoke of the shipbuilders who had labored through cold dawns and late nights of the crew's months of training to make this day possible. I told a short story about a young machinist's mate I'd met on my last visit to the ship, how he'd spoken of the Resolute, like a person, not a hull, because to him, she already was. Then I let the undercurrent rise. In this, Navy invitations don't command respect. Achievements do. The sea doesn't care who you know, only that you're ready when she tests you. It was the only line that made Margaret shift in her seat. I didn't linger on it. I simply let it pass through the air like a buoy marker, obvious to anyone who knew how to read it. I closed with a charge to the crew to carry their ship's name with honor, to take care of one another, and to remember that every port they enter will judge the Resolute by the way they conduct themselves. When I stepped back from the podium, the applause was full and unhurried. Sailors along the lifelines clapped in unison, their sound sharp against the open air. I saluted the ship's captain, then moved to my seat at the edge of the stage. From there, I could see Margaret again. She was speaking to no one now, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The band began another march as the commissioning orders were read. In that moment, I realized something. This wasn't a victory over her. It was simply the truth standing in daylight, and daylight doesn't need to argue with the dark. The rest of the ceremony unfolded with the practiced precision the Navy is known for. Orders read aloud, the ship's sponsor giving the traditional "man our ship" and bring her to life, and the sudden eruption of bells, whistles, and cheers as the crew ran aboard. Flags broke in the breeze. The Resolute came alive in a way only a brand new warship can. Her hull, now a living part of the fleet. I stood through it all, letting the sounds wash over me, the heavy thud of boots on the brow, the layered harmonies of the band, the deep blare of the ship's whistle. There's a current in moments like this, a sense that you're watching the first page of a book that will be written for decades to come. When the formalities ended, the pier shifted into reception mode. Sailors mingled with families, shipyard workers accepted thanks from officers, photographers corralled smiling groups in front of the ship's bow. I made my way down the steps from the stage, immediately greeted by a line of junior officers and chiefs wanting to shake my hand. "Ma'am, your speech hit home," one lieutenant said. "We've all seen the difference between people who've earned it and people who've just been given a seat." That's the thing, I told him. Seats don't mean much if you can't stand when it matters. An elderly shipbuilder approached next, his hands still carrying the faint scent of oil and steel. "She's a fine ship," he said, nodding toward the Resolute. "You did her justice today." I thanked him, knowing praise from the men and women who actually built her carried a weight you can't manufacture. Off to the side, I saw Margaret. She stood with her two friends, but for once, she wasn't holding court. Her hat brim shadowed her eyes. Her hands were clasped in front of her. When our gazes met, there was no smirk, no theatrical wave. Just a small nod, maybe acknowledgement, maybe something else. I returned it with the same economy. No words, no victory lap. Some things are better left to settle in the quiet. A young ensign I recognized from the crew approached me then. "Admiral, he said what you said about the sea, not caring who you know. I'll remember that." "Good," I said, "because out there, the only thing that matters is whether you can be counted on. Every time." I stayed another 20 minutes talking with sailors, posing for photos with the crew, and answering questions from the local paper about the Resolute's capabilities. All the while, I kept catching glimpses of the ship, her decks lined with sailors at the ready, her mast high and clean against the sky. She was the real center of this day, and I was content to let her carry it. As the crowd began to thin, I walked toward the end of the pier. The air was cooler now, the tide pulling out. From here, the Resolute looked like she was already moving toward the open sea, even as her lines still held her to the pier. I thought about every time Margaret had tried to frame my career as her accomplishment, every sideways comment, every reworded truth. And I realized with a calm, I hadn't expected that none of it mattered anymore. The people who counted the ones who would follow me into heavy seas or trust me with their ship already knew the truth. Respect wasn't conferred by an invitation or erased by someone else's version of events. It was built watch by watch, decision by decision, until it became unshakable. I took one last look at the Resolute, saluted her crew from a distance, and turned to leave the pier. The band was packing away their instruments. Families were heading toward the parking lot. My footsteps echoed against the boards, a steady, familiar cadence. If you're hearing this and you've ever been told you only have what you have because of someone else, remember this. Invitations may open doors, but they can't make people respect you. Only your actions can do that. Only your record, written in moments no one else sees, can stand when the music stops. And if this story reminded you of your own hard-earned victories, share it with someone who's still in the fight to prove themselves. Subscribe if you want more nights like this, stories that honor the truth you build with your own two hands.